Hello everybody and welcome back to my YouTube series on human anatomy. Thank you so much if you watched the first one. If not, check it out. It's all about the anatomical position. It's a lot of jargon that you're really going to need to know moving forward in your anatomy career. Anyways, in this one I want to talk about the skull, and I want to split it up into the neurocranium that houses the brain and the visceral cranium that forms your facial skeleton. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe because it does mean a lot and it really helps me out. Thank you. This is the cranium. There are 22 bones in total. 8 make up the neurocranium, and 14 make up the viscera cranium. This is the neurocranium, and as you can see, it's the part that houses the brain. The 8 bones that make up this part are the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the occipital bone, the 2 temporal bones, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid bone. Alright, so let's start with the frontal bone. This bone forms the forehead and the superior rim of the orbit, also known as the eye socket. On the superior rim, there's a small indent called the supraorbital notch. This notch acts as a path for the supraorbital nerve. Specific landmarks for this bone include the coronal suture, which is the intersection between the parietal bones and the frontal bone, and the bregma, which is the intersection between the coronal suture and the sagittal suture. The frontal bone also interacts with the sphenoid, forming the sphenofrontal suture. The parietal bones form the supralateral part of the skull. They come together to form the sagittal suture right down the midline of the skull. They also articulate with the sphenoid, forming the sphenoparietal sutures on either side, and the temporal bone, forming the sphenosquamous sutures on either side, and finally the occipital bones, forming the lambdoid suture. One specific landmark of the parietal bones is the vertex, and this is the most superior or tallest point of the skull. The temporal bones are divided into 2 parts. The squamous part on the lateral aspect or on the outside of the skull, and the petrous part that houses the inner ear. Along with interacting with the parietal bones to form the squamous suture, the temporal bone also articulates with the sphenoid to form the sphenosquamous suture, and the occipital bones to form the occipitomastoid suture. The occipital bone is a single bone that forms the lower back of the skull. This articulates with the C1 vertebrae at the occipital condyle. This bone also contains the inion, which is a posterior prominent part of the skull. Once again, the occipital bone interacts with the parietal bones, forming the lambdoid suture, the temporal bones, forming the occipitomastoid suture, and the sphenoid, forming the sphenobasilar suture. The sphenoid is located in the middle of the skull, between the frontal and temporal bones. This forms the posterior part of the orbit, or the eye socket. This bone articulates with the parietal bones to form the sphenoparietal suture, the temporal bones to form the sphenosquamous suture, the occipital bone to form the sphenobasilar suture, and finally the ethmoid and some other bones of the visceral cranium. The ethmoid is a single bone that forms the medial walls of the eye socket, interacting with the frontal and sphenoid bones. Alright, so those were the 8 bones of the neurocranium. Let's review really quickly. First, we have the frontal bone. We have the 2 parietal bones, the 2 temporal bones, the sphenoid, the occipital bone, and in red just here, the ethmoid. The frontal and parietal bones form the coronal suture. The frontal and parietal bones form the coronal suture. The parietal and occipital bones form the lambdoid suture. The parietal and temporal bones form the squamous suture. The sphenoid and the frontal bone form the sphenofrontal suture. And the parietal bone and the sphenoid come together just here and form the sphenoparietal suture. Also, the parietal bones come together along the midline, just along here, to form the sagittal suture. Alright, so that was the neurocranium, so now let's breathe through the viscera cranium. This is the viscera cranium, and as you can see, it's part of the bone structure that forms the facial skeleton. There are 14 bones in total, however, a lot of them are pairs, so it's not a lot of memorization. First, we have the mandible. This forms the lower jaw. Next, there are the two maxillary bones. These form the upper jaw, the bottom part of the eye socket, and part of the nose and palate. Here are the two zygomatic bones. They're also known as the cheekbones, and they form the outer wall of the eye socket. The nasal bones are a pair of small bones that form the bridge of the nose. The lacrimal bones are even smaller, and they're located in the medial wall of the orbit. The palatine bones form the hard palate and also the medial wall of the orbit. The vomer is a single bone that forms the nasal septum. And finally, these two scroll-like bones are the two inferior nasal concha that are also inside the nasal septum. Alright, so let's conclude. First, we have the mandible. Next, we have the maxillary bones, the zygomatic bones. Remember, these are the cheekbones. The nasal bones, the inferior concha, the vomer, the lacrimal bones, and finally in red here, the palatine bones. Alright everyone, so that was lecture 2 of our human anatomy series. I really hope you enjoyed, and I also hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. It means a lot, and it also lets me know that there's people who want more of these videos. So once again, thank you so much. In episode 3, I want to go over the cranial nerves, which gives a lot of anatomy students a little bit of difficulty, so hopefully I can clear some things up for you. Thank you. See you in the next one.